Now, welcome to the third book talk organized by the International Society for the Critical Study of Divination. My name is Michael Lackner, and I have the honor of serving as president of the society. You can find our website at criticaldivination.org. And this society was founded in 2016 as part of the International Consortium for Humanities, for Research in the Humanities, entitled Fate, Freedom, and Prognostication, Strategies of Coping with the Future in East Asia and Europe. Now, from 2023 onwards, the society succeeds the consortium, which was funded by the Federal Ministry of Education, the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, for 14 years, from 2009 to 2023. Now, during this time, we have published, let me see, okay, this is the how to reach us. We have published a book series, a book series with Brill, which now comprises 11 international volumes, and further volumes are in preparation. And in addition, we publish a journal entitled International Journal of Prognostication and Divination and Prognostication. And I think now also, together with this book series, the consortium and now also the Society for the Critical Study of Divination have established the research of pre-modern forms of prediction, prognostication, forecasting, in short, strategies of coping with the future as a solid and consolidated field within the humanities. And following an idea of our colleague, Dr. Li Gang, we have begun to organize a series of talks on the books published so far. And it's my pleasure to moderate the second talk, which will be on a book which will be introduced very soon. But let me first introduce the participants of this book talk. First of all, the author of the book, Luis Campos Ribeiro, who is a researcher at the Department of History and Philosophy of Sciences at the Faculdade das Ciências da Universidade de Lisboa. He is specialized in the history of sciences, history of astrology, which will be the topic of today, history of art, and medieval and modern scientific images. And among his publications, we may cite Nautical Astrology, a Forgotten Early Modern Tradition, Jesuits and Astrology, Print versus Manuscript, and a book which he edited, if I am right, no, which he contributed with Elena Avelar de Carvalho, who unfortunately passed away. We are still regretting her presence here. She was present at this here. Okay, so far, because Luis will himself introduce the book. And then the next is Jeffrey Kotyk, who has been a visiting scholar at our consortium in 2018, holds a PhD from Leiden University in 2017, and he has researched the relationship between China and the wider world in late antiquity, with a particular focus on the eastward transmission of sciences, that is, say, astronomy, astrology, medicine, and metallurgy to East Asia. Recent survey, Astrology and Astral Magic in Tantric Japan, which appears in the Oxford Handbook of Tantric Studies. He's presently participating in the Department 3 working group, Visualization and Material Cultures of the Heavens in Eurasia and North Africa, where he is contributing to the database and authoring a book on cosmology in pre-modern East Asia. He's also the author of Sino-Iranian and Sino-Arabian relations in late antiquity, which China and the Parthians, Sasanians, and Arabs in the first millennium, which just came out with Brill again in 2024. And then the next one is Francisco Malta Romeiras, who is a research fellow at the Department for History and Philosophy of Science, Universidade de Lisboa. His research interests include science and religion, early modern science and medicine, and book censorship. He has published widely on the Jesuit science and education and is the author of Jesuits and the Book of Nature, Science and Education in Modern Portugal, again with Brill, 2019, and a Biblioteca Erudita da Campolide, a Historia de uma Biblioteca Dispersa pela República, which was published in 2022. Lots of other publications could be enumerated, but I stop here, I think, and even stop my presentation. Okay, the book series and the journal, and that's it, and I stop sharing, and the floor is yours, Luis.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here and to be able to talk a little bit about my book, which is one of my recent works. So let me just share a little bit. Okay. Okay, so this is the title, as we already know, we have established. So Jesuit Astrology, Prognostication and Science in the Early Modern Culture. The book was published by Brill in 2023 in the Time Astronomy and Calendars collection. So the book stems directly from my PhD research, which I obtained in 2021, and expanded and revised for publication. So the book, so the work is this matter of Jesuit astrology, which was one that was pending research for quite some time. I divided it into 4 parts. So first introductory part, which discusses some highlights of astrology in the early modern era. So in order to introduce a little bit the context in which the Jesuits are engaging into astrology. Then a part on the Jesuits and astrology, and their relationships, both against, both in favor of. Then I engaged my main topic and my main data set, which was teaching instruments that Jesuits had, manuals and manuscripts regarding the teaching of astrology, which were abundant here in Portugal. And it was interesting to know exactly if this is something that was unique here or something that had a much wider range. And then, of course, Jesuit astrologers. So are there Jesuits practicing astrology? Do we have evidences for that? And what do we know? So the first part it discusses mainly and makes an overview, just an historical overview, then discusses the big central issue of the church and astrology, or the prohibitions and the bulls, the index, which is it's an early modern phenomenon, strictly early modern phenomenon in terms of prohibition. Also talks about an important topic, which then relates to Jesuits, which is the mathematization of astrology. So astrology becoming increasingly technical and mathematical, accompanying also the development of tables, instruments, etc. And then, of course, the marginalization of astrology from accepted science, which happens in the later half, gradually in the later half of the 17th century and throughout the 18th century, which marks the end of astrology as an accepted scientific practice in the Western world. So the first part, Jesuits and astrology, I debate exactly first Jesuits against astrology, which was perhaps the better known position that they have, because there are several printed works on this. Then, of course, the lesser known, which is Jesuits accepting astrology. Where can we see the discourse of Jesuits accepting astrology and engaging with astrology in a more positive view? And especially the chapter 7, which is astrology in Jesuit science. So we know the Jesuits to be important figures in the transmission and the development of science in this period. And thus, where is astrology in that discourse, specifically in the mathematical and astronomical works? For example, the image I use here is a chart, an example chart calculated by Christopher Clavius in some of these his unpublished notes, where we have the famous Clavius, which was discussed in academia if he accepted or not astrology. And then we find that in some of his manuscripts, he is much more accepting of astrology than in the official writings, although we could say that in the official writings, the acceptance is there, but he doesn't engage the topic, so he doesn't get into more trouble than he already had with the issue on the defense of mathematics. So this, to simplify, a very complex dilemma. And then this chapter still engages two aspects. So astrology as a cultural currency. So what is the role of astrology in the East? And here I have to thank Jeffrey for his help in deciphering these Chinese prints, because I'm not at all a sinologist, so I have no idea what it's written here, or very little, in which it is clear that the Jesuits were using prognostication and astrology to engage with the Chinese government and all the imperial settings, with the calendars and all of that, so that and there was even the idea of replacing the systems of divination with proper modern astrology prognostication, Western prognostication, which they considered more exact. So this means that there must be a level of acceptance of the possibility of prediction to astrology. And in fact, the only known printed work on the Jesuits on astrology is this manual, the Qiangshui Xiong. I might be butchering this, where there is an introduction to the basic principles of astrology, which we still have to find if it is a translation or an adaptation of somewhat existing work. Then, and then I explore also the same topic on the Americas and what's the role of the Jesuits in the development of astrology and the teaching and transmission of astrology to especially Southern America in the early colonization of the New World. Then, of course, the central topic, and the one that I developed more, it's the Jesuits teaching astrology. I do show in the second part that there are several of the well-known Jesuit mathematicians and astronomers who engage in astrology, who teach astrology, and by their writings, this is all printed materials. Through their writings, we do see teaching of astrology. We have evidences of teaching of astrology also in Oropesa, Spain, in the College of the City of Oropesa, where Jean Vremen, who passed there and gave a course on mathematics, also does astrology, and including in the astronomy session. And then, of course, we have the famous class of the sphere, the Aula de Esfera at Sant Antão, a college in Lisbon, one of the major colleges here in Portugal, where we had a specific class on mathematical subjects, which included, of course, arithmetics, geography, navigation, astronomy, and, of course, astrology. And here, since the 70s, or even a little earlier, it was known that it existed several manuscripts on the teaching of astrology. And so the idea was to understand exactly in what context does these astrology teaching lessons come, because we would assume that Jesuits, being a very strict religious order, would not allow the teaching of astrology, which was forbidden. And also they were engaging with science. So the use of astrology was sort of puzzling for the late 20th century historians. And it was only in the 20th century, in the 21st century, that we started to have one paper by my supervisor, Enrique Leitão, which sort of discussed this is not as simple as we think. So I engaged that and I explored their teaching of astrology. So I explained a bit the aula and the several teachers who engage astrology, and then what exactly are they teaching? Because we have full teaching materials, so we can understand exactly what's their approach and what they want to do. And the thing is, and this is a part of a Volvel that I have here in wider view. So this is something that is a foldable Volvel that is at the end of one of the manuals, where you have all the basics, so sort of a cheat sheet for astrological practice. And the main idea that we can understand is that there was this group of Jesuits, which include international figures, but of which we're lacking a bit of information, who considered astrology a practical aspect of science in terms of prognostication. So they wanted to use a form of natural astrology, so an astrology which would be in turn with the rules of natural philosophy. So we have natural causes, so that we wouldn't raise the problems of free will and the problems of prognostication. So they do this very clear separation between superstitious astrology and natural astrology. So they engage this natural astrology, and the earliest of them all, which is João Delgado, which was the first teacher of the Aula de Esfera, tries to adapt current day astrology to fit into this pattern. And what I found is that they want it to be natural, so something that can be explained by natural philosophy, something that can be practiced in accordance to Christian precepts of free will and future events, and then something that is very heavy on mathematical and astronomical background. So they have these three aspects, which I think it is what characterizes their practice and their teaching of astrology. So they try to be rigorous. Of course, the interesting thing is that throughout their manuals, and I have here some of them, they have difficulties because astrology is much older than Christianity. Astrology, for astrology to fit into Christian terms, we have to start off slicing, and we get a very small bit of what astrology can do. And of course, it doesn't fit all demands that astrology always had throughout the pre-modern period. So they clearly have difficulties in trying to fit astrology into these strict patterns of Christianity and of course, of natural explanations. So we can see throughout the reading this kind of difficulty, which is quite interesting. And sometimes they're going back on their on their position on certain astrological factors, because simply if they don't, they cannot make it work for their purposes, which are, of course, agriculture and navigation, which basically is astrometeorology, weather prediction. That's the huge core of their practice. And then some of them do engage in natal astrology, nativities, with the purpose of medical medical applications, or then just mainly to know one's natural inclinations, which is still within the accepted precepts of the church. But of course, this raises lots of problems, because if you do that, then there's a lot of things that come out. And what people want of astrology in that period is to know if they're going to marry, if they're going to get money, if they're going to get the job they want. And this is something that technically you could not do if you are too strict with church precepts. And then finally, on the last part, which is just comprised a chapter, which I thought, should I include or not, but then I decided to do, I discussed some practitioners, Jesuit practitioners of astrology, and how much we do. We don't know lots of them. We don't have a fair few names, but we do have documents. And I'm sure if we start researching other countries' archives, we're going to find more where you see prognostications made by Jesuits. The one that is illustrated here is a prognosis of the eclipse, the solar eclipse of 1652, which is presented to the then Prince, Don Teodosio, and it is done by a Jesuit. He says he doesn't introduce himself, so we don't know who he is, but we do know he's a Jesuit, and he says it in his text. He does this prediction on the eclipse, and it has a very interesting aspect, which is so far the only one, and I wrote a paper on this with Enrique Leitão. It's the only known text, as far as we have, that they use observations through the telescope incorporate the changes on shapes in the planets and the visualization of the planets into a prognostication, a normal standard astrological prognostication, which is, as far as I know, something I've never seen done. And so he's not only we are talking about someone who is good with the telescope and knows how to work with the telescope. He's a good astronomer, and at the same time, he's giving astrological advices to the court. So, and with this, we have several other, most of them anonymous documents where we see that you have Jesuit authorship or strong connections with this kind of prognostications. And basically, not to make a very long introduction, that's what the book is about. It's big, so there's a lot written on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Luis. I just should mention that Christoph Clavius is my fellow countryman, and I was born in the same town as he was. But just one question before I open the floor, and then I remain silent. Natural astrology, that includes prediction, or is that a sort of a kind of reserve they had towards other forms of astrology? The books you showed were about judicial astrology, and that, in my view, includes prediction, right?
Exactly. That was one of the weird things that initially create a lot of confusion on these manuscripts, which they do say literally judicial astrology. What the problem here, and I discussed this in the book to a certain extent, is how are they dividing astrology? So, what is the Christian approach to astrology? And if you start reading the sources, you understand that for the most part, until you get to the 17th century, I would say, or very late 16th, there are two different types of astrology. You have superstitious astrology, which includes elements that you shouldn't be doing as a Christian, you shouldn't accept as a Christian. And then there is natural astrology, where things are explained. But both of these types of astrology can be judicial. Actually, judicial is the name of astrology itself, in the sense that you can call it astronomy or astrology. The terms are interchangeable. And then you have theoretical or speculative astrology, as they say, or astronomy, which is astronomy as we know it, the mathematical bits and the observational bits. And then we would have the judicial part, or the prognosticatory, as they also say, which means judgments. So astrology makes judgments. So even natural astrology is judicial by definition. What seems to happen is that when the bull comes out in 1586, there is, and even the ninth rule of the index seems to sort of conflate the term judicial with the superstitious practice. Although it doesn't say it clearly, what seems to happen is that in the religious documents, judicial begins to have the connotation of something that is forbidden, something that is superstitious. And so, together with the criticism of astrology, which is rising in that period, so the judicial astrologers, that term becomes pejorative and associated with the same superstitious practice. And I think that's the confusion. And what happened is that most of the historiography picked up on that to make the characterizations we have nowadays in historiography. So that's a term that we have to really think depends on the time period that we're talking about and in the context. So it's a complex complex division. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, that of course invites for more discussions, but who wants to talk first? We have two discussants, Jeffrey, Francisco, as you like. The perspective.
Sure, I'll go first.
Let's choose first the perspective from afar. Okay. Jeffrey, floor is yours.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to say that Lewis's book is extremely valuable because it touches on a subject that until recently hasn't really been recognized in the history of science, in particular, the history of astronomy or astral science. Jesuits obviously had a role to play in the dissemination of astrological knowledges and practices, and as his book has demonstrated in his research, that this knowledge was disseminated as far as China, and the Jesuits actually had a role to play in basically affecting the Chinese practice of astrology. So there was a practice of horoscopy and reading horoscopes and electional astrology going back to the year 800. And then later there was the Islamicate transmission of astrology in the early Ming Dynasty in the 14th century. Marco Polo also noticed that there were various kinds of Persian and Islamic astrologers in the Chinese capital as well. So this final transmission of European astrology through Latin into China it's quite significant historically, and it also just emphasizes that even something like astrology does have a function to play in our understanding of East Asian history, even in the early modern period. A lot of people tend to overlook something like astrology because it's treated as a pseudoscience or unimportant to global history, but clearly, as Lewis's research has shown, it's very important. So again, I just want to congratulate him on publishing this great book, and it really is a monumental work that I'm sure many people will learn a great deal from in the coming decades. So my question kind of goes back to early Christianity. I know that Saint Augustine is sort of the authority in Christian or Catholic theology for banning or prohibiting astrology. So my question is, how did the Jesuits address the fact that the early forefathers of the church were very much anti-astrology, and they didn't distinguish between judicial or natal astrology? It was just categorically astrology. So could you maybe comment on that?
Okay. It's not an area I'm fully expert on. What I know, it's what I researched in this context. But yes, Augustine is one of the monumental sources for this debate, of course, as you were saying, and he is against astrology. He's not very lenient with practices, although he does allow it to some kind of weather prediction, because what I think in practical terms is happening here is that we know that a lot of religious Christians and religious people were practitioners of astrology, were students of astrology. The clergy was one of the main source for the practitioners. So we have a whole population that is aware of how practical and how useful astrology is in their current context. So then we have the prohibitions. So they kind of have to balance between what's forbidden and what is practical, useful, and that they see working, and that they believe that it works. So they have to do this kind of juggling, which is not that serious. It's a mere debate for most of the Middle Ages. But now we get into practical, the practical applications here with the index and then the bull. And the escape from this is Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is the one that's going to turn things around. And Thomas Aquinas, I would say, bluntly picks up on Augustine's words and proves rhetorically that he's in favor of astrology, and then proposes a whole form in which astrology could be allowed. And in the sense that astrology, so the planets would not affect the soul. It could not affect the soul or the supernatural element, the spiritual element, but it does affect the body because it's an earthly materials. But, and as he says in this very famous word, but the body, through the planets suffers inclinations to do certain things. The body does. The soul can contradict them. But as he also adds, but usually it does not. So most people do not contradict their own inclinations. So that's why we see astrology working, because they're simply following their natural physical attributes. And so in this clause, that you have a physical influence that is very visible in an individual's life, allows a safe practice of natal astrology in a religious Christian context, although it has its caveats. So, for example, it cannot go against free will. So you can choose. At long run, you can contradict them, but it allows prediction, because you know there are inclinations there that the person will be likely to follow. So there is some prediction there, limited. Even if we look at Thomas Aquinas, he does allow a lot of the astrology to be practiced, but in terms of natal astrology. But if we are very strict in the parameters, it's not that much. It is a bit more open than Aquinas, than the position of Aquinas, but still it's going to cut a lot of the astrology off, especially, for example, the interrogations, so the questions, the astrology of questions, which is, as far as we are aware, the major part of the practice. You don't go to the astrologer to do a reading of your nativity, or you could, but it's not common. What you do, you go and ask a question about something very practical of your life, and that practice is absolutely forbidden through these terms. So I think it's Thomas Aquinas here that is giving this lenience to the practice, and the Jesuits are big followers of Aquinas' position, theologically speaking. So
this is his the writing, the Judicis Astrorum, right?
Yeah.
And if I remember well, I mean, it's basically the moon that serves as an evidence, because everybody knows that the moon exerts a certain influence on this earth, and then he goes further and further and further, which is very interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. It was very informative. Thank you for that informed answer. I didn't know about Aquinas, so I'll follow up later on about this. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Welcome.
Okay, so I did not prepare a question for Luis, but I wanted to emphasize the importance of his work, which he is too humble to admit. So what he has done in his PhD thesis is truly remarkable. So writing a 600-page dissertation on this topic is something phenomenal. And there are many things. I wrote a review, and I was sitting in his committee before, and I read the book twice, first as a dissertation and then the book. And what strikes me is that you can have there two major PhD dissertations. So you have this general context, which is not merely an introduction. So he is doing lots of original research, studying the context of astrology in the early modern period, in Jesuit context in general. And he makes very bold arguments. And one of the things that I think is remarkable, which he already mentioned in his presentation, is the discovery that you have three types of stances among Jesuit writers. So you have those who are firmly against astrology, those who support it, and those who wane, or whose position changes over time. And discovery regarding Clavius' manuscript. So this is impressive. So it was not the focus of his research. That was the analysis of the lessons of the Lisbon College the Lisbon College of Santo Antão. And I think it's remarkable that he was able to find that out. And this brings us to an important take, which is the difference, and this interests me as I'm interested in the history of censorship, which is the difference between manuscript and print. He also published an article on that. So whereas in manuscript, some things could circulate in Europe, and he shows that very, very correctly, in print, things were rather different. And so it is not by chance that the only printed treatise on astrology is very, very far away from Rome. Right, and this is truly an achievement. I was talking about the state of the art. Well, how this appeared, and I think this is also important for us as historians. So Luis was mentioning that it was known since the 70s, more or less, that these lessons contained some teachings of astrology. And what is remarkable is that it took almost 5 decades for someone to really examine them fully, and this is this for me is impressive. So many historians knew about it, and in the Portuguese context, many historians wrote about the history of astrology in the early modern period, but they did not have Luis's skills to fully analyze and understand the scientific content of these lessons. So this is an innovative way of doing the history of astrology in Portugal. This completely changed the field. When Luis and Helena appeared and started working on the history of astrology, they immediately became recognized as the most influential authors in the field. They really know what they're talking about, and that makes a huge difference. I was lucky enough to write a paper with Luis recently, and we found out that indeed interrogations is what is being done, right? This is what people care about, and I think that just a very final comment. What Luis has done, and this is very unusual for a PhD student, is to open a completely new field of research and establishing his own school. So he has already influenced some master students, some PhD students, and this is very, very impressive. So looking at the technicalities of astrology is very important. And this is not just a very internalistic approach, a very dated debate in history of science, because he indeed combines historical acumen and depth with this more internal history of astrology. And I think that is really commendable. So since I've read the book twice, I don't know what else I can say, or I can ask to Louise, but I do recommend that if you have not read it, that you read it from cover to cover, because there are many novelties there. The book is very elegantly written. The analysis is superb, and indeed, this is for sure a landmark in the history of astrology. I would say in the early modern period. He just takes the Portuguese case, but this is much more broader. This will have for surely an impact, a broader impact on the history of astrology in this period. And so, congratulations, Luis, again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's more than a comment. That's very good. No, I mean, no doubt that this is a milestone in the history of research in astrology. In fact, I would like to ask, if I may, Jeffrey, about this Chinese manuscript, not manuscript, but this Chinese print Louis showed us. And then, you know, as a follow-up, I mean, I'm far away from having studied astrology, Jesuit astrology in China, but wasn't there a certain Father Smogoletsky who introduced also some tenets of Western astrology? Okay, that's my very amateurish question.
Well, yeah, we do. There are two main publications. This is one of them, and then we have Smogoletsky's publication, which he does in collaboration with the Chinese scholar. So the book is a mix of Chinese practices, divinatory practices, with an input of an update, let's say, of Western astrology. Unfortunately, I never had the chance of seeing copy of the book. What I know of that is through papers that have been written, quite good papers, on how influential were these two works on the dissemination of Western, or so European early modern astrology into China, into Japan, and into Korea. So they're quite important works, and we do have that collaboration. I think. And I don't know if any Chinese scholar has already engaged this. It would be interesting to know exactly what is contained in those books. So try to understand exactly, because this one I presented, which is by Charles von Bell, is just an introduction, a basic introduction. And still, I remember that Jeffrey, when he helped me read it, he realized that there were some interesting adaptations to the Chinese astronomy of the period. So that in itself might be very interesting to study. But Smogliecki's collaboration is much wider because, you know, he has the introduction, but he has also mundane astrology, so weather prediction, nativities, etc. So it is a larger, it has much more information. It is a larger manual, so it would be interesting to really go in depth into that kind of study. But as I said, I'm not a sinologist, so I'm very limited in what I can do in that regard. Yeah.
In the future, maybe within the next year or two, hopefully we could collaborate and maybe
Yeah.
translate the material alongside whatever sort of Latin sources we have available.
Yeah.
And that would be a good publication in itself, you know, looking at the Chinese with the critical commentary and then framing that historically. And so that's a sort of rare encounter that we can study as a sinologist and as a Latinist together. So in the future, I hope we can go ahead with that.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. Yeah.
I mean, we know that even the contribution of Jesuits to the Chinese calendar was accused in Rome as superstitious, in fact, or as contributing to Chinese superstition or engaging in Chinese superstition. That is something interesting. But I mean, if we could expand, or you could expand a bit on this difference again. I mean, I get my previous question. Natural astrology on the one hand and superstition on the other. What was considered as superstitious, or what? I mean, we know the official part, I mean, which you still can find in the Catholic Catechism of today, right? But okay, we have three types of Jesuit attitudes to astrology. But okay, the most superstitious one, I would like you to on this one, yeah.
Okay, so I think there are, I don't think anyone has ever done an in-depth study of exactly what this means and how it changes through time. But one of the main precepts is anything that goes against free will be superstitious. Also, anything that makes claims to know about chance events or things that are hidden is one of the other things. These are the core of the discourse of the church. So if you, for example, and that is going to affect the interrogation practice, because it's very common for people to come into the astrology and say, well, I'm missing, you know, a silver plate from my house. Who stole it? So the astrology does the chart for the moment that question is asked, and he will find out who the thief is, allegedly. So that infringes on a lot of things, especially because he's going to know hidden things or secret things, because we don't know who the thief is. And if he can identify it properly, then he's having knowledge of secret things. Also a common question, which doesn't appear too much in the early modern period, but it was quite common, was if if a woman was virgin or not, for example. You know, that's also a private hidden thing. If she is or if she is not is something private. So if you are aware, if you are able to do that through astrology, then you're infringing on secrecy. And so it is justified that it is possible, most likely by the assistance of demons, that you would know that information, and that information would be correct. The problem was, and Francisco knows a bit more about that because of our recent work on the Inquisition, if you were right, you were in big trouble, because if you were right in the answer, then something supernatural, something demonic might have infringed, interacted with you willingly or unwillingly. You were manipulated by demonic forces. So that would be superstitious. And I'm, of course, any kind of magic, talismanic thing would be completely off, unless you would justify it with natural philosophy very much, and some do. We have Athanasius Kircher, who does that a lot. he manages to get himself safe into those kinds of topics, you know, but always with what he called natural magic. But still, I think that is the main thing. And of course, if you ask for something, if it's going to happen or not, and the answer is correct, or it can be done, or can be done if it's going to happen or not, you're infringing on the free will of someone who's making that decision. You're infringing on something that is secret, something that is a future event, something that is a chance event. So that is very problematic for Christian theology, and that is I think the core of what they consider superstitious practices, excluding, of course, the obvious one of evoking planetary spirits and that kind of thing, which is that's very easy to spot out. You know.
Yes, thank you. Planetary deities and okay, yeah. Any more comments, questions? I mean, I could go on for hours, but may I? Yeah, please, Jeffrey. Yeah.
I guess this is kind of stretching the topic a bit, but do you know what the present Jesuit position on astrology is? And have you had experience speaking with the Jesuits about this?
I haven't. I haven't actually. So I don't know.
Because the Pope recently on Twitter condemned astrology.
Yeah, well, theoretically, if you go by the book, it is something that is still forbidden and not a lawful practice for a Christian. But what happens today, that it adds also that is a pseudoscience or something that's considered fake. So you get the religious stance and then you get the scientific stance together and you mix it, and that's the novelty of our current position on astrology. But I don't know. It's not something I have engaged, so I don't know the full answer. But of course,
Okay.
Jesuits were always very interested in alternative methods, as long as they don't go against Christian rules. So I'm sure some have
Okay, thank you.
explored that.
May I add something?
Please.
So I'm not sure, Luis, if it stands the ban only on judicial astrology in the sense of the bull and the index, or if that is, in principle, could you still perform natural astrology or not within Christianity? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But the thing is, Luis presented his research several years ago at the seminar of Jesuit history in Lisbon, and it was very remarkable because in the audience there were also some Jesuits and Jesuit historians, and they were not, well, they were surprised, of course, in a sense, but again, as Luis was saying, they were always interested in doing science outside of the box. So I think it's a very, very interesting question, right? To see what is the current, if the current prohibition of astrology, in the same box as the other divinatory sciences or not? Because going back to Aquinas, which is still one of the main authorities in Christianity, that would be allowable.
Yeah. Technically, yes. The problem is, again, is astrology something that exists? Because, you know, current natural philosophy, let's go like that, science doesn't accept that it's possible to have that kind of correlation. So if you go by that precept, you know, it's not scientifically sound, and there are spiritual problems associated with it. What kind of mixture comes out of it? I really don't know the answer, and perhaps a current day theologian would know exactly what's the position, but it does raise different problems. And of course, there's always the problem of, most of the time, the church is reacting to, and this is probably true for today as it was true in the early modern period, they're reacting mostly to popular astrology. So astrology that is being told and practiced, you know, a little bit out of the canons of academia or of properly consolidated knowledge, and that seems to be the main problem of the church with the knowledge of astrology, that it might be misunderstood and misused by those who don't really understand all the implications of astrology. So I think most of the time, I would say almost 90% or 99% of the time, when you have a scientific, to current day, you have a scientific or religious reaction against astrology, it's going to be, to sun sign horoscopes of journals and that kind of thing, very popular, simple view of astrology, I suppose.
This popular aspect is also a feature of the Chinese attitude. In fact, I mean, people who, were considered as charlatans, people of the rivers and lakes, Jianghupai, kind of, Sherwood Forest people who exerted all kinds of divination. And that was the main concern, to be cheated. And that was also prohibited. Whereas, of course, diviners played an important role at the courts, and very, very similar. Can I just jump a bit to the east again and ask Jeffrey how widespread this kind of sort of Western astrology was in China? Because we have so many other methods of divination. We have the 4 pillars and a kind of Chinese horoscopy, which was widespread. So my question is, this kind of Western astrology, what was the reception and to what size, scale, was it really spread in China?
That's a good question. So when we go back to the Tang Dynasty around the year 800, you have Indian and Iranian astrology translated into Chinese. And that becomes very popular in the next 100 years. And then in subsequent centuries, you have Islamicate astrology in the early Ming period. And it seems that it was quite widely practiced. There was like the Chinese adaptation of horoscopy. And so by the 16th century, you have very large astrological manuals being compiled. So clearly it was a major form of popular divination. Now, when it comes to the Latin materials, that becomes a bit more ambiguous because after the translation of them, I don't really see them in the textual record. So when I search for keywords in the available textual corpus of Chinese, even looking through digitized texts on Google Books for those keywords, I don't really see that these texts had a large influence in the Chinese textual record. So I'm not really sure how accessible the Jesuit astrology was to common people. It might have been accessible to the astronomers at the Chinese court, but whether that diffused into the popular practice or not is unclear. And also when you look at the Chinese practice of like horoscopy today, particularly in Taiwan, where they never went through the Cultural Revolution, they tend to actually just look at the texts that are in the Siku Quenshu, so the Qing Dynasty canon, but that doesn't have the Jesuit astrology. It only has the astrology up to the 16th century before the Jesuit astrology. So I'm not really sure Chinese astrologers in the present day or in the 20th century even had access to the Jesuit astrology. So that's my sense of it at the moment.
Thank you. Now there's a boom of Western astrology all over the Chinese-speaking world, but that is not really related, as far as as I know, to the Jesuit astrologer.
Right, right.
Yes, please. Any more? Any more?
If I may.
Yes, of course.
I'm no expert whatsoever in this field, but I'm just curious about 2 questions. One is you mentioned, Luis, that astrology and astronomy was not clearly distinguished in certain period, but today when we read these 2 terms, they're completely different things. So I was wondering, since when and how this distinction and what kind of factors contributed to or leads to this sharp distinction of these 2 fields. And another thing is you have in your title, you analyze the phenomenon in the framework of modern culture. So I was wondering, what did you have in mind? Why did you choose to put it in modern cultural as a framework in which you analyze this phenomenon? What contributed to your choice of culture? And then what kind of cultural aspects do you think that has an influence on the categorization and on the attitudes and on this evolvement of astronomy that you studied?
Okay, so let's start with the first. So from a very early period, and let's go back to the Greeks or to Ptolemy, there is a distinction between what we call astronomy and astrology. So between the measuring and calculation aspect, the mathematical aspect of observing the skies, and then the interpretation. And even Ptolemy says that to make the mathematical calculations much more precise than to make the judgment, to make the interpretation, because interpretation is not as precise. So that distinction exists. But this is all done within a major field, which is sometimes called the science of the stars, which would include astronomy or astrology. And for the most part of its history, astronomy is mostly serving. So astronomy is mostly serving astrology. So you construct tables, you construct instruments, you make measurements, you define measurements in order to produce better tables, so you can practice a more precise astrology. And that seems to be what's happening throughout all the pre-modern period until the 17th century, where all the new discoveries and the big changes in cosmology start to create a field where astronomy and then the knowledge of the celestial world and how it works becomes a thing in itself, which gives rises to modern astronomy, astrophysics, etc., throughout the 18th, 19th, and then 20th century. So the separation exists, and this part of interpretation simply disappears. But for most of the time, they would coexist. That doesn't mean you might not have, medieval or early modern astronomers who wouldn't practice astrology and wouldn't think it, interesting or precise. You do have some, but that doesn't mean that they're not learning it, and it's part of their corpus of knowledge. So I think the distinction is basically late 18th century, I would say, when these new disciplines of astronomy and astrophysics and related disciplines start to become something of its own, of their own. Before that, you wouldn't have knowledge of the celestial world. The celestial world was out of reach. You could measure its movements, predict its movements, but what substance and what they were made of, it would be, they would know. You couldn't have that kind of knowledge. That was divine knowledge, so you didn't have it. So that's basically it. The other question you did was regarding the modern culture. Well, my work is early modern, so I don't go into current day practices. But if we're thinking in terms of lines of effects and how does this engage with modern practice, I would say that modern practice and the way astrology is seen by its own practitioners still nowadays is very, very affected and framed within these church precepts that free will must exist, that prediction is limited, that you cannot predict chance events, etc. So that sticked on, and it was transmitted to philosophically speaking, to even contemporary practices of astrology. Although then contemporary practices of astrology are mixed with a lot of a very diverse set of new philosophies coming from the New Age, Western philosophies, and Eastern philosophy, and you have all that mixture that becomes much more complex. But I think that's the main main effect of this change, a very strict change of the early modern period. And of course, again, as I was saying, this comes accompanied with the discreditation, the fall into discredit of astrology, especially in the 18th century, which is, the big mark of change in that period. And then astrology becomes fused with what we call now occult sciences or esoteric science or occult sciences, which was not something that was very strong, at least before the 18th century, I think. I don't know. Did I miss something of your questions?
Not really, but I'm just thinking of because here at Erlangen we are also thinking about this this transition. And for instance, some certain esoteric practices, some of them have always been rejected. One of the criteria we're looking at to identify esoteric practices is the rejected knowledge. And I think astrology in the modern period also went through quite similar processes. But can you also talk about if you have to evaluate this process, what kind of consequences does it have for our society, for our
Well, then we have to go into current day affairs, but which I'm less historical, more of an opinion or point of view I have. But what seems to happen, and with all these categories, and these categories are complex, if it is an esoteric knowledge, if it is an occult knowledge, rejected science, where do we fit this? It's quite complex, and again, it depends on the period. But although you see that astrologers of the 17th century and even of the 16th century do engage with practices that we could call occult or magic or other even divinatory practices, it's quite common to see them practicing, for example, geomancy together with horoscopy, which are completely distinct methodologies. They share a few symbologies, but they're distinct. However, and that seems to be hand in hand because it was an interest, occult, even magic was an interest, even in its natural forms, is there. And again, the Jesuits engaged that. Kirche is the which is the big example of that kind of engagement. But what you see as we advance into the 18th century, and then it's now I'm reaching beyond my usual area of research, so I just have a little fragmented idea of this. But as you move on to the 18th century, I don't think anyone has ever done a true history of astrology, 17th century forwards, what's happening there, what's really changing in terms of the consistency, the philosophy, the ideas behind the practice. But you see an increasing mix of astrology with the other spiritual practices, evoking spirits, that kind of thing starts to appear together with astrology a lot in the manuals we have of that period. And so these practices began to coalesce together and to mix in the same kind of category. And I think that affected the way astrology is seen. But if astrology is rejected in scientifically speaking, then it has to hold its consistency with some other kind of justification, and you then have the spiritual or the mystical or the esoteric to justify that kind of why it works and how it works. And that's what it's carried on through to the 19th and then the 20th century. There's always this sort of spiritual background to astrology, while in the pre-modern era, so before the 17th century, you have a more scientific view of things. It says it is the natural world that justifies how astrology is. So I think this is the main structure. And one of the characteristics of current day astrology is that it doesn't have a unifying philosophy. While you would have natural philosophy and Aristotelianism as a unifying philosophy that supported why astrology did what it did and what were its limits, it's there. Nowadays, you don't have that. You have a sort of a very heterogeneous mixture of possibilities and beliefs, some of them highly contradictory between themselves, but people still put them in the same context. So it is a completely different structure. However, you still see the marks not only of this religious Christianity restriction, as I was saying earlier, there's still the matter of free will is still, an annoying stone in the shoe, as well as, of course, the fact that is a rejected science. So it's not accepted as proper science or proper scientific knowledge. And this has a much bigger impact in astrological practice nowadays that I think even practitioners realize.
Thank you so much. I mean, we are running out of time, but that was a great statement at the end. And I'm absolutely convinced that we should keep in touch in the future, because there's so many things to be told, to be studied, and well, even to be seen,
Yeah.
So thank you all. Thanks to Luis, thanks to Francisco, thanks to Jeffrey.